So what is a Blazor component? By official document, it is a self-contained portion of the user interface with the processing logic that enables dynamic behavior. Okay, but what exactly is it? Here's my version of it. It is a class that implements iComponent interface that participates in the DOM rendering process. It still doesn't make too much sense, right? Let's write a class that implements iComponent. It's under the namespace microsoft.asp.NET Core.components. There are two methods to be implemented. The attach method gives us the RenderHandle, and that is the key for this class to participate in the rendering process or DOM manipulating. We usually use this as a chance to create a field pointing to the RenderHandle. The other method, setParameters async, that will be called when we have all the parameters for rendering, and this is usually where the manipulating of the DOM happens. Now the render method takes in a render fragment, and that's a delegate that holds a render tree builder. So I'm creating one with the lambda. And I'm going to put a hard-coded content of hello component. And since this is an async method, we're going to return a completed task. As you can see, it's a class that implements iComponent. And how does it really participate in the rendering? Here we come to index.razor, by the way, by itself. It is a component as well. And we use the test component, the one that we created just now, in form of a tag. Notice that we put it below the survey prompt. And this is how it looks like when it's rendered. So that is the component in a nutshell. Let me repeat it again. You use the attach method to get the render handler, and then call it in setParameters async method to manipulate the DOM. And that is, my friend, one of the most important concepts in Blazor component. Let's go over some components that we are already familiar with. Inside a Blazor project, you almost always have this app component. It comes with the template, of course. Then there's a survey prompt, the main layout, and all these pages. Those components are actually typical. Each one of them has some traits. We're going to go over them. But before that, you notice those are rather pages rather than classes, and they don't implement iComponent, do they? Well, let's find out. After the compile, you'll find this fishcard.frontend.dll on the disk. Let's decompile it. I'm using ILSpy here. Use whatever you are familiar with. So firstly, the OR class, app.razor, was compiled to app class. It inherits from component base. Let's try another. How about counter? It also inherits from component base. The fishcard, also component base. So what is this component base? Let's follow the lead. And it is an abstract class that implements iComponent. So let's see what does it do in the attach method. It did some pre-check and then created a reference to the RenderHandle. Pretty much what we did. Now, how about the setParameter async method? It sets the parameter properties, avoid double initialization, and then it calls to this wrong init and setParameters async. And what does it do? It will call this onInitialized method. And this is one of the lifetime methods that can be overwritten by the inherits. Oops, clicked something wrong. Let's come back to the component base. After calling onInitialized, it is calling onInitialized async, which is the async method that could be called during the initialization of a component. And then it calls the state has changed. And once checked this component should render, it calls the render handler to render the fragment. And then it will call the post-render methods. And what does this tell us? A render page is actually a class that derived from component base. And what does the component base do? Besides saving the render handler, just like every component does, it also calls lifecycle methods at an appropriate time, so that the reader page, again, inherits from it, will have virtual methods to override, and those methods will be called before or during or after rendering. Let's see an example. Coming back to fishcard home.reader, now that we know it is a class, it can override this onInitialized async method, for example, and hand over the rest to the component-based class. So is reader page a class? Does it implement iComponent? Here you have your answer. Okay, we get it, but then how is that useful? You're going to find your own answer, but I'm going to give you an example. Let's say I want to separate the chunk of C# code in the code section with the rest of the page. Is it possible? We know fishcard home is compiled to be a class, right? What can class have in .NET? Partial class. So I could create another class, also named fishcard home. There are some keys. Firstly, the namespace need to match with each other. In our case, it's going to be fishcard.frontend.pages. That is the convention the reader page uses. Second, when you create the class, don't forget the partial keyword. And otherwise, you could guess it's going to be an error that an existing class already been there. Now let's move the code over. We need to reference the appropriate namespace. We also get the intelligence to see the methods that we could override here, which is a great sign saying everything still compiles. And now we could totally wipe out the code section from the reader page. This fish home page will run just as it was before. Now let's go over some quote-unquote special components. The first one is a page. Based on the understanding of the last video, a page is a component that you can navigate to directly. We put page directly to the top of the reader. And those are built to these route attributes. The router will use that information to figure out which page to load. If you want to know more about that process, go back to check my last video. And that is the only thing that is special about pages. Move on to another type of the component, layout. Layout component is usually used as a template for pages. We often use it to host the shared components. For example, the navigation menu that will appear on every page, we would want to put them in the layout so that we don't need to repeat them again and again on every page. Basically, in Blazor, before a page is about to load, the router will check if there's a layout for the page. If there is one, it will render the layout first, and then render the content of the page into the body of the layout. This is going to be very beneficial if you have a brand or something that you want to share across the whole website. You put it on the layout, and it's always going to be there. And when an update is needed, you don't need to do it on every single page. There are two things worth noticing. First, a layout has this inherits directive, and it inherits from the layout component base. So it doesn't directly derive from component base. Second, you notice there's a body directive. When it is running, the page content will be loaded there. Let's dive a little bit deeper. Coming to main layout, which inherits from layout component base. And if we follow that, layout component base inherits from component base, which is not a surprise. What is special about this class? It has a body property, which is a render fragment. Let's take a look at an example. In this main layout, we have on the page a nav menu, and that is why the nav menu is always there on every page. And then we have this placeholder for the body. Now, let's mess around it a little bit. What if we have two bodies? When the time we run it, we see the shared navigation menu always show up in the same place. And then the body of the page is rendered twice. Now, although it feels like so, layout is not automatically applied. The default layout is here loaded in the app component by the router component. But you actually could have a different layout for a specific page. Here I'm going to create a new layout for our fish card. We make it inherits from layout component base by using the inherits directive. Let's see what we want here. For example, I want a link to my home page to show up on all the pages that I built. That's a div of a tag. And then we're going to render the body. Simple like that. And since this is different than the default layout, I'll have to go to the fish card razor page, and I'll use the directive of layout here to point to the fish card layout. Now let's see how it looks like when it runs. We go to the pages of home, counter, fetch data. They are all still using the default layout. But if we go to the fish card, this is a new layout, and that is one step closer to what we are trying to build. The last type of a special component that I want to mention is the app component. By itself, there's nothing special about it at all. It doesn't even have to be named app. What makes it special though, is that this is used as the root component. If we go to program.cs, you're going to see app to be used as the root component. And that's the origin point of the whole UI. And the first thing app does is read the component of router. When the routing succeeded, it will load the page inside the body of a layout. But if the route failed, you're going to see this sorry, there's nothing in this address prompt. And that is our app component. Alright, so much for the component. Next video, we're going to use what we learned so far to actually put up the content of the fish card. And I'm looking forward to see you there. Keep coding, keep improving, give me a thumb up if you like the content. And I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care. When we have all the when we have what? All the meter? What was that? To get the RenderHandle, it calls this a state.